Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam alaikum. Man John Alexander Smith hastam as dobe agaye rais hamkarani fakhite khanamha va abayan fik mikonam ke farsi man kheli خوب نیست. بهتر است انگلیسی صحبت کنم. خیلی متشکرم. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Vahid Ghobadian for inviting me to comment on his book. I also want to follow up by asking two questions, and I shall attempt to answer these questions. The first thing, of course, is the book itself. Sustainable Traditional Buildings of Iran, a Climatic Analysis. Now, to me, there are two very logical parts to this book, and Dr. Ghobadian has clearly indicated thus. The first bit, the climate, or climatic regions, very clearly deals with the urban and building forms throughout Iran, from the northern to the southern coastal regions, the central plateau, the mountainous regions, and so on. And I think this has been systematically handled very carefully indeed. The second part of the book deals with the building types and the influence of the climate on these building types. So they're very familiar to many of us, I guess: the bazaar, the mosque, the hammam, the Abanbar, the Yakche, the Caravanserai, and there's even a section at the end to consider bridge and bridge design. So this response to the climate for traditional buildings is obviously steeped in history and culture and so on. But it's very interesting that this book is approaching design from the perspective of climate and the influence of climate on building design. The first question I would like to ask is, what is the context of this book? Well, context can be measured in terms of the bibliography about Iran, and in particular the architecture, the buildings, and so on. And there are many fine books published in recent years dealing with Iran's architecture, but mainly from the visual or cultural perspective. Here in Dubai, I have a number of books concerning Iran and its wonderful geography, terrain, settlements, individual buildings, and so on. And I can cite, for example, J. Yasser Vali's 7 Climes of Iran, a photographic survey, or Jassim Ghazbanpur's Iranian House. Wonderful books, beautifully illustrated. The latter, in particular, has some fine plans of traditional houses from the various regions in Iran. But I would emphasize that, excellent as these books are, they tend to concentrate on the outstanding visual or aesthetic characteristics of the buildings, the architecture, and so on. In trying to understand the building as a response to culture and need and so on, these are very, very clear. So I think Vahid Ghobadian's approach, by determining the building form as the consequence of climatic influence, is really quite significant. Understanding our buildings over the spread of many centuries is an evolutionary process, and it's this sense of creeping up on us that we tend to miss the obvious. So climate is such a fundamental in any approach to design, whether it's landscape, urban, or building. So I'm intrigued because I think this has great potential for the future, and I'd like to consider this subject by asking the next question. The second question I would like to ask and attempt to answer is simply this: what is the significance of the book? Well, the author asks us to not only think about traditional buildings and how climate has shaped their design, but I think he's inviting us to think of the building as a climate modifier. Now, this is not a new concept in itself, and I can think back to the 1970s when I was a student. We had the oil or energy crisis which had been generated by OPEC, and I remember in Britain we were down to 3 and 4 day weeks, meaning we had to save a lot of energy, a lot of power during the weeks, and many buildings were actually powerless. So this in turn arrested our attentions to the limitations of importing energy from abroad, and it gave us a wake-up call in terms of how to be energy efficient and conserve our resources to some extent. So the building as a climate modifier was a component in an environmental approach to design that I seem to recall during my student days. Now, subsequent years have actually developed further thinking on conservation and responsibility of energy and so on. And this has led us to reappraise our approach to urban and architectural design based on what we now refer to as green principles. So, to understand green principles, we have to try and very clearly disseminate the basic principles themselves. So, one very fundamental principle is energy conservation. Second one, minimizing the use of new resources. The third one is have respect for the users of these buildings that we design. Sometimes architects are quite correctly accused of ignoring the user client for the benefit of the money client, as it were. We should also learn to respect the site, the natural environment of our buildings. Touch the earth lightly, and all these notions come to mind. We should work with the climate, and this is where Vahid Ghobadian's book pays a particular service. And finally, the sixth principle is quite simply to integrate each of the previous principles in what we would call an holistic design approach. So this book, in a sense, is a trigger for a whole series of events and sequential thinking.